We've added a lot of coding tools to our toolbox throughout this course. And as we added new tools, sometimes we added new wrinkles to how we read our code. I'm going to walk you through some strategies for reading code, considering all we know now. Reading code isn't too unlike reading a book. We just have a few extra wrinkles to consider. With a book, you typically read from top to bottom, left to right in the English language, and you go from page to page as you go. We start out with code that can be read top to bottom, just like in books. In this example, we can read each line in order to figure out what might happen next. So we move forward, turn left, move forward. It's pretty straightforward. Then we added functions of our own. So we wrote some code that would be run at a later point. For this code, we tried to imagine being swift. We got to this func keyword and said, okay, we have to remember this function for later, and we're going to scan for the closing brace and then start reading and actually running code after that point. So we get on it, we run that code. When we get to our own function, we jump back up to the definition of that function and read through that code top to bottom. Then we resume where we left off. In the syntax of many of our coding tools, we see these curly braces wrapped around our code, like in if statements, while statements, and so on. We see these curly braces. In the last example, the code that will run when we call our function is written inside the curly braces. This tip of looking for the braces will help us when we get to more complex code like this. We look at the code within the first set of braces first. This is the enclosing set of braces. This green code here is the code that's going to get run inside of our loop when the washing up isn't done. As we read through this code top to bottom, we hit another code block. This is another while loop. We match the curly braces for this block and step into the code. When we finish running those commands, we'll exit that block back to the enclosing block of code and continue running commands. So we'll go back to our previous sequence and we'll do the next command, which is put dish away in this case. And then once we're done with that command, we hop back to the top of the loop. We evaluate the condition, is the washing up done? If the washing up is done, then we keep going. We don't keep going because we have the logical not operator there. But if the washing up is done, the not will flip it to false, and then we'll be able to exit this loop. With for and while loops, we read through the code top to bottom inside those braces. We jump out occasionally when we need to if we've written our own functions. Then we had variables come along, and now you read top to bottom through your code, jumping out to functions or looping where necessary, and you substitute the last value for the variable where it's used. In this case, the first show function will print mat, because that's what value is kept in our name variable. We then change it to Anya, using that assign operator that we talked about, the equal sign. So when we call the show function again, it will look up the value of name and print out Anya, because that's the most recent value stored there. When we see functions with parameters later, we'll use the same technique. Variables will be passed into our function or others' functions, so we'll follow the value of that variable into the block of code for the function. When we learned about conditionals, we could start to branch our story. Depending on whether a condition is true or false, we navigate to a particular block of code and run that. In this example, we have a variable called isHungry, and it's set to true. So when we evaluate this code, we hit that if condition, and we say if is hungry, that evaluates the true. So we run the code inside those highlighted curly braces, sit down, eat food, and then the way we use if statements is we skip past any else blocks or else if blocks once we execute one of the statements in the block. When we talked about types, we see that we're now calling methods on instances of types. So we're actually leaping out to other code on the byte type here to run code inside those functions. But we can simplify the way we think about this and still read it top to bottom. The biggest takeaway when reading through our code is to follow the braces. Tapping on them in Swift Playgrounds will highlight them, matching the braces so you can see what code is run inside a particular block. This will help us a lot when we move from chapter 9 to chapter 10 in Everyone Can Code Puzzles, where we are asked to go back and look at some of the code we've written and evaluate whether we would still write that same piece of code today, given all that we now know, or would we change things and move it around. Having gone through this experience of learning how to read the code and learning how the code gets run and where code jumps around from point to point, this is going to help us become better programmers in reading our code, reading other people's code, and then designing code. So even before a line is written, we'll be thinking about how this code will actually get run. All right, we'll see you on our next live coding session.